Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to the podcast British Culture, Albion Never Dies. The Alphabet of Britishness is back. This month I'm looking at the letter S. What does S stand for in the Alphabet of Britishness? I asked my wife and she said S stands for Stephanie Crichton, which is her name. So, of course it can stand for S is for Stephanie. Of course she hears all these podcast episodes before they're even recorded. I talk them through with her. But I asked on my Instagram, on my Facebook, and I immediately got from Pete Brooker, Snooker. Of course he's the author of From Tailors with Love, with his co-author Matt Spacer, and of course he's on the YouTube as well, From Tailors of Love. A few people suggested sport as well. So I looked through the Britishness of various sports. It seems that Britain has invented a wide variety of sports, or at the very least, we have codified them in such a way that the rest of the world has agreed with. So we codified football from 1863, cricket from 1787, rugby from 1871, golf as early as 1502, basketball, volleyball, hockey. Even thought that we might have invented baseball. It's first referred to in a British children's book, a little pretty pocket book written in 1744. And of course, had invented rounders, although it has some French influence, and I've also heard it referred to as Dutch rounders, although I couldn't find much reference to it. I remember that's what it was called at the children's school I went to. I found a lot of detail on the website Made Up in Britain, especially about football. According to them, the origin of football, referred to as soccer by some, can be found in every corner of geography and history. The Chinese, Japanese, Italian, ancient Greek, Persian, Vikings, and many more played a ball game that kind of resembles football. The Chinese football games date back as far as 3,000 years ago, and of course the ancient Greeks and Romans used football games to prepare warriors for battle. In Britain too, there are records of football being played for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it was in England that the modern game of football really began to take shape. In 1863, the first Football Association, FA, was found in England. According to them, according to Made Up in Britain, in the Freemasons' Tavern in Great Queen Street, London, on the 26th of October 1863, rules for the modern game were laid down in a series of meetings. Central to these meetings was Ebenezer Cobb Morley, who lived from 1831 to 1924. He wrote to Bell's Life newspaper proposing a governing body for the sport that led to the first meeting. He wanted a common set of rules so that clubs from all over the nation could compete with each other. Little did he know this would become the biggest sport in the world. My own thoughts on this. It is remarkable, once you start to get the middle classes moving around on trains, suddenly this becomes a factor, the ability to compete with each other all over the country. Before then, of course, football could be very, very localised. As it says earlier in the article, as far as 3,000 years ago, people were playing football with each other, but of course it's a village playing among itself, a village playing with the next village. You read medieval accounts of football games in England, which could span rivers and hills and mountains and all sorts. But it was all played according to rules that everybody locally understood. But of course, people didn't travel around in quite the same way that we did from the Victorian era onwards. In fact, if you want to have a real look into how the railways changed life in the UK and then started to change life around the world, I think you couldn't do better than checking out Michael Portillo's Great British Railway Journeys, which you can see highlights and clips on YouTube. You can find it on various streaming services. It's a fantastic series for the social, cultural history of our railways. He'll travel around just the little railways in the UK using a Victorian guide to the railways to see what's changed. And he's an interesting man, a former Conservative Member of Parliament and Cabinet Minister who's found a new lease of life as a TV presenter on these rather quaint TV shows, but I think gives a fantastic insight into the UK and also a good feel for how the railways changed Britain. So, that was football, and I really enjoyed looking into that. Then, I enjoyed looking into, cricket. I found a really good BBC article, The 7 Amazing Sports Invented in the UK, just had a really strong article on cricket, which it referred to as that rather confusing game of bats, balls and wickets, which tends to last for several days and is of uncertain origin. Nevertheless, we can be pretty sure it was invented in England. The first definitive reference to the sport appears in a piece of court evidence given in Guildford in 1597. The first international matches were held in the late 1800s. Heather Knight, captain of the England women's cricket team, came in for a chat with Radio 2 after they had won the Women's Cricket World Cup last year. Interestingly, the Women's Cricket World Cup, which launched in 1973, is 2 years older than the men's, which kicked off in 1975. I don't know if kicked off is the right term to use with cricket. I wouldn't like to kick one of those balls at speed. But anyway, it does seem to be a peculiarly British and Commonwealth sport, and in many places where I've worked, say in the Gulf, you can see people from India and Pakistan playing cricket pretty well anywhere there's a space to do so, and with pretty well any equipment that can function. It has spread throughout the world. Famous cricketer, I just thought have a look, William Gilbert Grace. Well, he's well known in English classrooms as the man with the most magnificent beard in Victorian England, but of course he is the greatest cricketer in Victorian England. Dominating physical presence, gusto and inexhaustible energy made him a national figure, performing outstandingly well in matches well into his 60s. Perhaps one of the more famous cricketers of recent years, post-war years rather than recent, is Sir Alec Douglas-Home, first-class cricket player and later Prime Minister for a whole 363 days, a relatively long tenure compared to Liz Truss. He is the second shortest serving Prime Minister since the Second World War, but a fine cricketer, and not thought to be a bad Prime Minister, actually. But, as I say, it was Pete Brooker who got there first, suggesting S is for snooker, and I have to give it to him. It did have the most interesting, to me, it's all subjective, interesting to me, history of any of the British-invented sports. And I found this article, The Origin of Snooker, the Neville Chamberlain Story, not that one, the other one, by a man called Peter Ainsworth. Now, he wrote, "The game of snooker was invented by Neville Chamberlain in 1875. Everyone knows that." Well, to be honest, I didn't know that, and I don't know if you knew that, but now I've read it, I know it, and I've read it to you, so now you know it. Anyway, he continues, "To be more precise, this is today's commonly accepted theory. But prior to 1938, there was an equally accepted theory that the game had been introduced by a Colonel Snooker of the Royal Artillery. Then came the momentous day when Sir Neville Francis Fitzgerald Chamberlain at last responded to the umpteenth letter speculating on the game's origins and staked his own claim, which was published in the Field on 19th of March 1938. I just mention here, because he doesn't really go into this in his article, that this gentleman, Sir Neville Francis Fitzwilliam Chamberlain, was Inspector General of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, from 1900 until 1916, resigning after the Easter Uprising, although himself cleared of any wrongdoing. It was on his retirement that he claimed his role in inventing or perhaps popularising snooker, which has been accepted by many. He has led a very interesting life and career aside from snooker, although the snooker is itself very interesting. This man, of course, was a British Army officer in India, and snooker seems to have been largely played by British officers in India during their duller assignments. For example, in Uta Command, known as Uti, or Simla, or Shimla, for that you should definitely read Kipling. And they would play it, for example, after campaigns in Afghanistan. Peter Ainsworth wrote that those recovering from wounds that were too light for the hospital but too severe to leave India for home would often just stay in army messes, along with those waiting to go into the field. So they're the full variety of young lads, and not so young lads, amusing themselves with various games. So this was a mess hall game, and I think for an insight into all this, you can hardly do better than read Plain Tales from the Hills by Rudyard Kipling, talking about those hill stations such as Simla, and for the best insight into life there, you might check the BBC series Plain Tales from the Raj, which is a deliberately similar title, and you can find it. It's been archived online. I couldn't find a place where the BBC was making it available, but other people have made this BBC series available. So Plain Tales from the Hills, Plain Tales from the Raj, gives an insight into life there, where games like snooker were becoming more and more popular. I'll carry on with the gentleman's research, because it is interesting, I think. He says, "It's generally accepted the term snooker as applied to the game came from a name given to first-year cadets at the Royal Academy at Woolwich. This would appear to have been in use in the early 1870s. Chamberlain, having first been made aware of it in 1875, but where did it originate? Dictionaries tell us that the phrase cock a snook first appeared in print as early as 1791, and has been suggested that the novice recruits earned their name by their habit of cheekily cocking a snook at their non-commissioned officers, their NCOs. There's also, according to him, an intriguing and colourful alternative. In the 1850s, there was a comedy duo called Hooker and Snooker, who were performing in the London theatres during the earliest days of music hall variety acts. So it could be that Mr. Snooker's character was sarcastically applied by the older candidates to the younger juniors at Woolwich, and the name kind of stuck. So it could be that this is the legacy of an actor otherwise completely forgotten. There's little available history on who was Mr. Snooker, but it could be that this was a term applied to hapless young cadets. Anyway, all part of the history of snooker, which largely comes from Brits. In India, of course, you can find some interesting reference to that time in the Agatha Christie novel Murder on the Orient Express. In the novel and in the classic adaptations, there's a fairly recent one with Kenneth Branagh in which they completely remove all those characters. There's a character played by Sean Connery in the 70s who gets completely written out of the modern version. But I do think that's worth either reading or seeing. And of course I first read that in the hotel where it was written. Made an impression on me, but those bits where it refers to British India, I thought, I don't know, maybe they would give some insight into the history of snooker there. Okay, the next most popular topic was Scotland. Thank you to Daniel Gaster and Budget Bond for suggesting that S is for Scotland. Surely the most prominent Scotsman in America is groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons, who, commenting on Bart and Lisa Simpson, says, "Oh, brothers and sisters are natural enemies, like Englishmen and Scots, or Welshmen and Scots, or Japanese and Scots, or Scots and other Scots. Damn Scots, they ruined Scotland." He's talking to Principal Skinner, who replies, "You Scots sure are a contentious people." And groundskeeper Willie replied, "You just made an enemy for life." Fine representation of Scotland there in The Simpsons. So, S is for Scotland. I spent a fair while reading up on Scotland, and like many, I tend to think of Scotland as kind of England was Roman Britain, and Scotland was the bits they couldn't conquer. So there's Hadrian's Wall that separates it, and the north, is wild and unconquerable, that's the Scots, and then the south of Scotland, Hadrian's Wall, it's all the civilised bits. And I believe George R.R. Martin, when writing, Game of Thrones, A Song of Fire and Ice, he said that the wall there is inspired by Hadrian's Wall. However, I started to look into the National Museums of Scotland website, I discovered a much more complex and interesting history, which actually shows Roman influence as far north as the Shetland Islands. Of course, there's Hadrian's Wall, the big stone one. There's the Antonine Wall, much further north, but apparently there are also Roman sea voyages that went all around Scotland, which I've done myself, and I have to say, I'd been living in the Mediterranean for about 7 years, then I did this, and it was a bit of a shock in terms of climate, so all power to the Romans for their ability to do this, and they seem to have settlements and Roman-inspired settlements, actually all throughout the lowlands. According to their website, even when Rome's armies were back on Hadrian's Wall, they kept a careful eye to the north. After all, a good general always knows what his neighbours are doing. With a combination of scouts, punitive raids and diplomatic activities, the Roman world stayed involved in Caledonia until the Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century. These relations with Rome were a key part of the early history of Scotland. Well, what better source than the National Museums of Scotland? So yeah, their early history is very, very much as part of Roman history as English history is. which interested me. And there are people who say that, yes, Hadrian's Wall was a military fortification. It was also, a trading post. It was also, used for taxation, bringing goods north and south. It was a method of control one way or the other. Of course, I know that for many, many around the world, the image they have of Scotland is from the movie Braveheart. I must admit, I missed it when it came out in the cinemas, and I haven't caught up with it since. I have entertained myself many, many times by Googling Braveheart, historical inaccuracies, and it tops the list of pretty well every list of historically inaccurate films I've ever seen, which entertains me enormously. Maybe at some point I'll watch the film itself and it will entertain me even more. I think the quote from the historian Peter Tranquaire, I don't know how to say his name, I've seen it written many times, but his popular quote from the book Freedom's Sword is that Wallace is a farcical representation as a wild and hairy Highlander, painted with woad 1,000 years too late, running amok in a tartan kilt 500 years too early. So yeah, they didn't wear kilts back then. The kilts that they wear apparently are the wrong style. He's claimed that it's kind of like a film about George Washington in which he wears a conservative 21st century business suit inside out. Except that there's only about 200 years between him and us, and there's 500 years for William Wallace of the film and when he should be wearing a kilt. And of course the wearing of woad is about the ancient Britons. Braveheart is also the wrong name. So the character in the movie is William Wallace, but Braveheart is the term for Robert the Bruce. So it is extraordinary that the man in the film has the wrong name. He has face paint he shouldn't be wearing, and he's wearing the wrong outfit. Apparently there's a quote in the movie from the ending. Sorry to spoil the film for anyone. In the year of our Lord 1314, patriots of Scotland, starving and outnumbered, charged the fields of Bannockburn. They fought like warrior poets, they fought like Scotsmen and won their freedom. Well, no, because after the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce continued his fight against the English for a further 14 years. So yes, a mere 14 years later. It also is extraordinary in its portrayal of Edward I. So I understand that in the film he wants to sleep with a random woman. Is it William Wallace's wife? Again, I haven't seen the film, but it does seem extraordinary. Of course, many medieval kings did have many, many mistresses, but the thing is, they have a film in which they have the one king we know didn't. He was an absolutely devoted husband. We know it's extraordinary, we know it's unusual, but he was, in fact, if you've heard of the tube stop Charing Cross in London, it's named after one of the monuments that Edward I built to his wife after she passed away. And he is an extraordinary man, known to generations as Longshanks. He's the conqueror of Scotland, nemesis of Braveheart, Sir William Wallace. His reign is one of the most dramatic of the Middle Ages. There's a book which I read many years ago by Mark Morris called A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Forging of Britain, and it is an astonishingly action-packed life. Edward defeated and killed the famous Simon de Montfort in battle. I believe as a teenager he travelled to the Holy Land on crusade. He definitely did conquer Wales, and of course built extraordinary castles, Conway, Harlech and Carnarvon, and again the Eleanor crosses that he created after the death of his wife are the grandest funeral monuments ever fashioned for an English monarch. So I think he's an extraordinary character, but as is Robert the Bruce. I mean, we're all taught the story of Robert the Bruce after being defeated by the English, going into the cave and watching a spider kind of climb up a wall and fall down, climb up a wall and fall down. Eventually it tries again, and eventually it can create its web, so if at first you don't succeed, try again. So, Braveheart, I'm sure at some point I'll see it, but if only to find out, what is this fuss and why did it do so well when it seems bonkers. I talked to a friend of mine who loves the film, and he said, yeah, it's complete nonsense, but you enjoy Lord of the Rings, you enjoy Star Wars. I'm sure the Millennium Falcon doesn't go 0.5 beyond light speed. What a ship made in Corellia of that kind. Anyway, Scotland. If I were to give you a recommended rabbit hole on Scotland, it actually would not be William Wallace, and it would probably not be Robert the Bruce, although he is interesting. My recommended rabbit hole is Scots in the British Empire. I think that is a particularly interesting thing, and it has been pointed out by more than a few that the decline of the British Empire kind of precedes the rise in Scottish nationalism. Once there was no more empire to bash about in, they started to become more interested in independence, less interested in the UK. Give us an empire to build. The Scots were magnificent at that. So yeah, Scots and the British Empire, my recommended rabbit hole. I must touch on tartan because it's so associated with Scotland, even though people all over the world, in early development of cloth, you just naturally come up with Scotland. But in Scotland it seems to have this real cultural significance. And here I was looking at the Scottish Tartan Museum. Again, go to Scotland for some sources on Scotland. I've often heard it said that really the idea of clan tartans doesn't exist in history until the 19th century. And they largely agree with this, saying that, well, yeah, traditionally, a family might make it in a particular way, but that's the same everywhere in the world. But, of course, the Victorians were very interested in kind of codifying things, classifying things, applying scientific genealogies and methodologies to things. So in 1815, the Highland Society of London wrote to clan chiefs asking them to submit samples of their clan tartans. The response was that many chiefs had no idea what their clan tartan was, so they wrote either to their tartan suppliers or asked older men if they recalled anything in particular being worn. And by 1822, when King George IV visited Edinburgh, a kind of a tartan festival partly organised by Sir Walter Scott, all the clan chiefs were asked to come out and greet the king in their, quote, proper clan tartan. So again, many didn't have a clan tartan. There were loads of new tartans created or renamed, and from this point on it was kind of became fashionable, the idea that every clan must have its tartan. They don't have quite such a long formalised history, although again a particular village might have one it prefers, but even the Scottish Tartan Museums admits that what makes a tartan, quote, official or, quote, authentic is not age or antiquity, but whether it has the approval of a governing body of what the tartan represents. So, if a clan chief or a state's legislature or the CEO of a company says it's the official tartan, then it is the official tartan, whether it's 2 years old or 200 years old. Brilliantly, I suppose that means that if I came up with a British culture Albin Never Dies tartan, apparently if I say it is my tartan, then apparently it is. If I have somebody working for me one day, and I force them to wear the tartan, then there you go. It is my podcast tartan, even if I've just made it up. Anyway, I think that's really interesting. The idea of it being a formalised thing is a very much a modern idea from the 19th century. Whereas, of course, traditionally, yeah, people in the village might wear broadly of that style, of course. Anyway, Scotland is a gorgeous country. It has a natural beauty that's hard to match. As I say, I've taken a ship all around the Isles of Scotland. I have experienced, I think, Dreich weather. I've heard some people say Dreich. I've been told Dreich, but that's where you get all types of weather at once. And I've had that on the top of a ship. It's something to do with the way the Western Isles break up different weather patterns, and so you get kind of sunshine, sleet, rain, hail, everything all at once, and wind from every direction. It is quite surreal, and I did feel that I was on a movie set with people kind of randomly chucking different weathers at me at the same time. But anyway, it is a very, very beautiful country. But that is all I have to say about that. So I must move on with some of the other suggestions. As I say, I'll be doing this for the whole month of January, but I think for this episode I do want to include, thanks to Mr. Purdy for suggesting this, S is for SAS.
Oh, you are? I like this poker thing. And that makes perfect sense. Since MI6 looks for maladjusted young men, I give little thought to sacrificing others in order to protect Queen and country. Former SAS types with easy smiles and expensive watches. Rolex?
Amiga.
Beautiful.
British Special Forces, the Special Air Service. I very rarely touch on military history. There's a lot of people who have immense amounts of detailed, specialised knowledge, and they go deep into military affairs. So I've very rarely been tempted to go into this, but okay. SAS, I might add in here the SBS. And they're often kind of conflated and confused, especially perhaps one of the better known SAS veterans or SBS veterans was Jeremy John Durham Ashdown, better known as Paddy Ashdown. He died as Lord Ashdown, born February 1941, died December 2018. I thought I'd go into his obituary in The Guardian. The Guardian is not always the friendliest to SAS types, so I thought I'd go along with theirs because it might be one of the more critical ones. As I say, he's one of the more prominent people. They had to amend it because they originally referred to him not as SAS but as SBS, but he'd actually fought with the Special Boat Service before it had its current name. So, let's first of all get into who he is. Paddy Ashdown was perhaps the most unlikely leader of the liberal strand of British politics. Former captain in the Royal Marines, ex-diplomat and rumoured a spy, he became the first leader of the Liberal Democrats in 1988 and led them over the next 11 years to their best electoral results at that time for 3/4 of a century. Although he never quite achieved the parliamentary breakthrough he hoped for, still less a realignment of the parties of the left in coalition with Labour, the Lib Dems became a significant and influential third force in British politics. So whilst the US, of course, is a two-party system, with Paddy Ashdown we ended up with a three-party system pretty well. Two major and one minor, but significant. I like this kind of segment by The Guardian. Square-jawed, eyes narrowed as if constantly scanning the horizon, resolutely refusing to confirm or deny that he knew how to kill a man with his bare hands from his days fighting communist insurgents in the jungles of Borneo with the Marine Special Boat Section. Ashdown looked like a leader of a more militant party than he actually led. If he was helped in the early 1990s by voters' growing disillusionment with the Tories' initial reluctance in southern Shire constituencies to trust Labour, he also had to overcome a ramshackle and near-bankrupt National Party machine and often non-existent local organisations. It continues. Ashdown was the oldest of 7 children, born in New Delhi, the son of John Ashdown, an Ulster Protestant who was also an Indian Army captain, and his Ulster Catholic wife, Lois, who had been an army nurse. The family did not return to Northern Ireland until after the end of the war, when his father invested his savings in a pig farm and then a market garden, both of which failed. Ashdown was christened Jeremy John Durham, but gained his nickname Paddy from his Irish accent when his father managed to obtain a place for him at Bedford School, where he himself had been educated. The accent was soon lost, although the nickname never was, and Ashdown was offered a military scholarship which paid the school fees. He excelled at sport, but not academic study. He failed his French O-level, though later became proficient in several languages, including Mandarin, Hindi, Malay, Serbo-Croat, German, and indeed French. I would suggest languages became important to him when they became useful. Just my thought. The Guardian continues. He joined the Royal Marines straight up from school at about the time his parents decided to make a new life in Australia. Ashdown served for 12 years in the Marines and saw action as a commando in Kuwait, Borneo, Hong Kong and Northern Ireland, where, in the early days of the Troubles, he was once required to arrest the Catholic civil rights activist and future fellow MP, John Hume, on the streets of Belfast. In interviews many years later, Ashdown insisted that had he been an Ulster Catholic, he would probably have joined the IRA or at least campaigned for civil rights himself. His fluency in Chinese led to a posting with the diplomatic service, formerly as First Secretary to the UN's mission to the United Nations in Geneva, where he was, allegedly, Ashdown was coy on the matter, required to listen in on the conversations of the Chinese delegation and cultivate contacts. But he threw up his promising diplomatic career for family life in Norton-sub-Hampden, a Somerset village near Yeovil, with his wife Jane, whom he had met at a military ball when he was 20 and married in 1962. And their 2 small children, and he joined the local Liberal Association. He wrote in his memoirs the decision was naive to the point of irresponsibility. Quote, "It just also happens to be the best decision I made in my life." Okay, so I just thought that would be of particular interest to people who follow my Instagram, Fleming Never Dies, because they're interested in Bond stuff, which tends to touch on, SBS or diplomatic service or things like that. So I thought that might be interesting. Of course, his political career and political scandals, highs and lows, are something you can happily follow off your own Google travels. And I just thought I'd have a quick look at the James Bond kind of military service. Of course, each cinematic iteration of Bond has had a slightly different military service. The one for Daniel Craig suggests that he's been with the Special Forces Unit 030, which is supposedly some part of the SBS, and that he's seen covert service in Iraq, Somalia, Iran, Libya, and active service in Bosnia. Upon completion of his duties in Bosnia, Bond was credited with saving the lives of nearly 100 men from a Serbian militia in one village, and Bond was recruited by the R&R Defence Intelligence Group and awarded the rank of Commander. So there is the link between the popular character James Bond and the SBS. I have more S's to cover, but I shall keep this at the 30-minute mark. I shall cover them later in the month. We have more S's coming up. S is for The Saint, for example. Of course, a popular TV show with Roger Moore, and books by Leslie Charteris. I shall be covering those with a very, very special guest very, very soon. Those were my initial S's. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you'd like to suggest some more S's, as I say, I'll be doing this all month. You can message me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies. You can email me at albionneverdies@gmail.com, and I'll be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening. More coming up this January. Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to this week's episode of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. S is for, well, several splendid suggestions, but okay, Secret Service should surely be the headline. Of course, episode 103, S is for Sports, Scotland, and SAS and SBS is already out, and I had some wonderful emails and messages all about it. Thank you very much. And also the same for episode 104. S is for Simon Templar, aka The Saint. So I'm carrying on throughout this month with the letter S. I've had some fantastic suggestions, so just thought I'd say at the top of the episode, thank you to everyone who's been messaging me, emailing, commenting, however you've got in touch. I really appreciate it. Of course, some people have subscribed to the newsletter, and that core group of listeners are, of course, in a monthly draw. So Matthew Spencer, hello. You have received your A is for Albion mug, and that's just for being a subscriber to the newsletter. Matthew lives all the way out in South Korea, so this is a truly international podcast. We do have listeners all over the world, and it's a great joy to receive messages from them. So as I send out a newsletter about once a month, and at the moment there are 31 subscribers, so plenty of opportunities to win in the lucky draw. This month I asked a random number generator to generate a number randomly between 1 and 31, and it gave me 21. The 21st person to subscribe to my newsletter wins a prize, and that person is Joan Harris. So congratulations. Please accept an email from me very soon so I can send you a Sears for Crumpets fridge magnet, or a mug if you prefer. So one more prize going out, and that's just to anyone who subscribes to the newsletter. You can subscribe by clicking the link in the podcast descriptor, or by emailing me at albionneverdies@gmail.com, or by messaging me on Instagram. However you normally get in touch with me, just do so. And if you'd like to receive the newsletter, which is often just a personal roundup of what's going on behind this podcast, or occasionally if I've appeared on another podcast, then I kind of drop it there. So if you'd like a bit more contact, in case there's something you've missed, subscribe to the newsletter, and you too could win a prize, like Matthew and Joan. So this week, S is for several splendid things. Where I live in West Yorkshire, it was snowing today. We had quite the snow flurry, and it has settled, so it survived the day. But I can't talk about that as a uniquely British thing, especially when there are so many listeners in Canada, including Simon Sartorially, an Instagram account all about fine clothes. The gentleman there, Simon, messaged me and suggested that S should be for Shires, and indeed the Shire. So first of all, a Shire in Great Britain is essentially a county. I had a look at the great description in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The Anglo-Saxon Shire, Old English Skier, was an administrative division next above the 100, and seems to have existed in the south in the time of Alfred the Great. So that's from AD 871 to AD 899. It seems to have been fully established by the reign of Edgar in the 10th century. It was administered by an ealdorman, or alderman, and by a sheriff, or a shire reeve. It evolved into the word sheriff later, who presided over the shire court. After the Norman conquest, the French term county was introduced and generally supplanted shire in preferred official use, although shire continued in popular use, and frequently even in official records, and lasted in many county names such as Cheshire, Hampshire, and Warwickshire. The root shire is still also joined to the names of smaller communities, such as the parish of Hexhamshire. Of course, when I pronounce it at the end of a word, it's always shire, not shire, and I know that this comes up when Americans try and pronounce Worcestershire sauce. It's said to be one of the hardest things to pronounce in the English language, but relatively easy, of course, if you've lived there, as I have. And I mention Worcestershire because, of course, the Shire was mentioned by Simon Sartorially, and the Shire in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and Middle-earth is often thought to have been modelled on the West Midlands, especially Worcestershire. Many of the descriptions of the Shire match closely to areas around the Malvern Hills. It is a place rich in history. For example, on the Malvern Hills, there's one hill which has kind of an ancient fort. I didn't even look that one up, but what I did is I went back to my various copies of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was, of course, a scholar of Anglo-Saxon literature and used much of their kind of orderings when setting out how Middle-earth was run and governed. So I really thought I'd go to the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, section 3 of the prologue, which is of the ordering of the Shire, and just have a quick look at what is a Shire in Tolkien's world. He writes, "The Shire was originally divided into 4 quarters, the farthings, already referred to, north, south, east and west, and these again into a number of folklands which still bore the names of some of the old leading families, although by the time of this history these names were no longer found only in their proper folklands. Nearly all Took still lived in a Tookland, but that was not true of many other families such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the farthings were the east and west marches, the Buckland and the West March added to the Shire in SR 1452. I'm going to say more about ways of counting years later. SR is, of course, Shire reckoning. The Shire at this time had hardly any, quote, government, unquote. Families, for the most part, managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. There had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of the King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the Hobbit still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thrain had passed to them from the Old Bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thrain was the master of the Shire Moot, and captain of the Shire Muster and the Hobbitry in arms, but as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the Thrainship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignitary. The Took family was still indeed accorded a special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured, nonetheless, of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and adding to his name if required a number, such as Isengrim II. The only real office in the Shire at this stage was the Mayor of Michael Delving of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the Free Fair on the White Downs at the Lythe. That is, at midsummer. As mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals, but the offices of postmaster and first sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the message service and the watch. I shall pause there. I know that not everyone is a fan of The Lord of the Rings, as I am. I've even been having some messages about that lately. But I think it's wonderful to go through The Lord of the Rings, compare it to Anglo-Saxon history, especially to Alfred the Great and the kings that followed, because of course that's what Tolkien himself studied, and much of what he wrote was an imagining of how Anglo-Saxon literature would have continued had it not been for the Norman conquest in 1066. In many ways it's an alternative timeline, filled of course with magic and wonder. I very much enjoy it, and I think it gives a great insight into the Anglo-Saxon shires and how they thought of themselves and how they portrayed themselves in literature. Okay, I shall move on to another S, as there are many to get through. S, suggested Simon sartorially. S is for Stonehenge. So, I started to look into this, and it's the oldest part of the Stonehenge monument. Was built during the period from 3000 to 2935 BCE. Now, that first thing set me off on a inadvertent rabbit hole. Stonehenge, I feel you know what it is. It's in the south of England. It's a pile of rocks piled on top of each other in extraordinary and interesting ways that line up in ways that are of great interest to many, many archaeologists and conspiracy theorists. Some people have suggested it was the first football stadium. I quite like that idea, but I got very, very distracted by BCE. Of course, I've been away from the Western world for 7 years. I haven't really come across this term BCE. I've seen it, but I had the time to look into it, so I did. And I found a wonderful article all about BCE and CE and what it means and why. Reading from the article, I found the movement towards BCE and CE has not been universally accepted, and BCAD is still more widely used, even though BCE and CE has been used in the mainstream since the 1980s. Just myself, I'm very glad they both refer to the same dates. Anyway, the article continues. There have been backlashes to the adoption of the new system in defence of BCAD, and notably in 2002 when the UK national curriculum made the transition. So school kids are using this longer initial. In 2011, education authorities in Australia were forced to deny that such a change had been planned for national school textbooks amid similar controversy triggered by media reports. So the UK is going one way, Australia is going the other, the more traditional way. Passions are usually highest among those who see the adoption of the new system as an attempt to write Jesus Christ out of history. They argue that the entire Gregorian calendar is Christian in nature anyway, so why should we attempt to obscure the fact? Others ask why such a well-established and functional system should be replaced, arguing that the existence of two competing abbreviations is likely to cause confusion. Indeed, it has also been argued that BCE and CE is in fact less religiously inclusive than BCAD. According to some, BCE-CE elevates the importance of Christ's birth to the start of an entirely new common era, before Common Era and Common Era are BCE-CE, while BCAD is a simple reference to the event. I do think that's really interesting. You're just assuming that it's a common era of all people on Earth. Of course, I worked in Saudi Arabia, where it is currently the year 1444, BH, before the Hijrah. That's the Islamic calendar, and it's widely used in Saudi Arabia. They don't use the Christian era or the common era, and so on. They do use this common era in China, so there it might be an appropriate term. And of course in Turkey they use just the year as the year. But you do come across the Islamic calendar sometimes in Turkish writing. But I say in Saudi, that was just it. It's the year 1444 this year. So it's not universally accepted by all people around the world. Anyway, I got completely distracted by that and didn't look so much into Stonehenge. So my apologies to Simon for that. I did look into Simon as an English name. I started to look into Simon de Montfort, who of course is essential to the story of Edward I, and Edward I, his story, is essential to the story of Braveheart, which I covered in the S is for Scotland episode. The full story that I really enjoy is in Simon Sharma's A History of England, and that TV show is still available on the BBC iPlayer. It's free to watch, which is great. And then there's a book by Mark Morris called A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Forging of Britain, which is, I find it fascinating. In an astonishingly action-packed life, Edward defeated and killed the famous Simon de Montfort in battle, travelled to the Holy Land on crusade, conquered Wales, extinguishing forever its native rulers, and constructed at Conway, Harlech, Beaumaris and Carnarvon the most magnificent chain of castles ever created. After the death of his first wife, he created the Eleanor Crosses, the grandest funeral monuments ever fashioned for an English monarch. Anyway, S could be for Simon de Montfort, and of course I couldn't resist googling, who's the most famous Simon in the world, and apparently it is Simon Cowell, so another British Simon. Okay, I said at the beginning I might do Secret Service, and that suggestion was from Daniel Gaster. In part 1 I talked about Sir Neville Francis Fitzgerald Chamberlain, and he was of course an old Indian Army officer who went into intelligence, drawing on his experience in India and Afghanistan, not to mention East Asia, for burgeoning British intelligence. These days we have the SAS, the Secret Intelligence Service, who on their website talk about how for over 100 years the SAS has ensured the UK and our allies keep one step ahead of our adversaries. We are creative and determined, using cutting-edge technology and espionage. They further state we have 3 core aims: stopping terrorism, disrupting the activity of hostile states, and giving the UK a cyber advantage. We work closely with MI5, GCHQ, HM Armed Forces, law enforcement, and a range of other international partners. Everything we do is tasked and authorised by senior government ministers and overseen by Parliament and independent judges. People who work for MI6 come from all walks of life, with different skills, interests, and backgrounds. I think anybody who's listened to this podcast will know that here is a perfect opportunity to tie it into the Secret Service, the Special Operations Executive of Ian Fleming, and this is where I got drawn into various books. For example, Ben Macintyre, the historian who wrote Operation Mincemeat, which was recently adapted into a movie with Colin Firth and portrays a young Ian Fleming working for naval intelligence, and also wrote the book For Your Eyes Only, Ian Fleming and James Bond, which sets out the connection between Ian Fleming in the Second World War and the Special Operations Executive that existed to try and harass the Germans in their occupation as much as possible. Tony Jutt's book, Post-War, gives a bit of an insight into this in the early chapters, which of course I reviewed for my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/British Culture. But going to the Ben Macintyre book on Ian Fleming, it talks about how, in the smoky hive of room 39, Fleming was Godfrey's frontman, Godfrey the head of naval intelligence, and as such he operated with considerable freedom. He liaised with MI6 and SOE, responsible for sabotage and subversion. He worked with a political warfare executive on propaganda and handled the press. He fielded demands for information from above and shielded Godfrey from interference from below. I shared all secrets with him, Godfrey later wrote. Fleming was also allowed to evolve and manage his own plots, or plans. The choice of word given his later career as a novelist seems significant. Some of Fleming's ideas were run-of-the-mill, some were fantastical and impractical, and some, in the opinion of his colleagues, were simply mad. Even Godfrey noted that Fleming tended not to let practicalities get in the way of a good plot. He had plenty of ideas and was anxious to carry them out, but was not interested in, and would prefer to ignore, the extent of the logistics background inseparable to all projects. In a sense, Fleming's task was to dream up espionage plans with convincing scenarios. Others would then be charged with trying to turn fiction into reality. In this he was preparing for, and precisely reversing, the process that would lead to the creation of James Bond. Among Fleming's more remarkable ideas were scuttling cement barges in the Danube at its most narrow point in order to block the waterway for German shipping, forging Reichsmarks to disrupt the German economy, dropping an observer, possibly Fleming himself, on the island of Heligoland to monitor the shipping outside Kiel, and sinking a lump of concrete off Dieppe with men inside it to observe the German coastal defences. They may have seemed nonsensical in retrospect, but at the time they were matters of life and death, and Ian treated his new job with a dedication he had never shown before, starting work at 6 a.m. and continuing late into the night. Of course, that book by Ben Macintyre is an overall look at wartime intelligence in Fleming's place in it and how it connects to James Bond. There's a special one by Nicholas Rankin called Ian Fleming's Commandos, the story of 30 Assault Unit in World War II. I've really been enjoying this. I picked it up just in the last few days, so I've been going through it, and it's all about a specialised unit created essentially to go into conflict areas and get as much useful intelligence and bring it home as swiftly as possible. So Nicholas Rankin's Ian Fleming's Commandos, I'm going through it. I might have to review it later on some channel or another. And I was helped by a friend pointed out a book in a bookshop called Ian Fleming and SOE's Operation Postmaster. That's by Brian Lett. And again, this is all about Ian Fleming's involvement with these various intelligence organisations, and coming across a fella in the SOE who signed his letters M. So whilst M is very definitely based on the head of naval intelligence, it seems that various codes used were taken from the SOE. In fact, I'd always assumed that the MI6, the Secret Service in Ian Fleming's novels, is very much drawn from the Special Operations Executive, as if it had carried on into peacetime. Their war had carried on and on. But that is something that's much debated among historians. I think Brian Lett, the author of Ian Fleming and SOE, goes down on the SOE route, whilst, of course, Ben Macintyre goes down more along the naval route. Anyway, these are Ian Fleming's creation is all fantasy, but it is interesting to look at the wartime origins of these daydreams, these fantasies. Okay, I shall move away from the war history to a suggestion that S in the alphabet of Britishness stands for stoicism and stiff upper lip. That came from the Instagram account X007RJP, and also on Facebook, from a Facebook group, Britain, People, Places and Pastimes. A gentleman named Martin, a lady named Janet. Again, I don't read out full names from Facebook, just because people often have that as their private thing, and they're not looking for people to follow them. I simply looked up on Wikipedia. I thought, I've got all these serious history books around me. Why don't I just use the Wikipedia and see what that says? So they say the idea of the stiff upper lip is traced back to ancient Greece, to the Spartans, whose cult of discipline and self-sacrifice were the source of inspiration to the English public school system, and to the Stoics. Stoic ideas were adopted by the Romans, particularly the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, "If you are distressed by any external thing, it is not this thing which disturbs you, but your own judgment about it, and it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now." The concept reached England in the 1590s, not the 1950s, the 1590s, and featured in the plays of William Shakespeare. His tragic hero Hamlet says, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Poems that feature a memorable evocation of Victorian stoicism and a stiff upper lip include Rudyard Kipling's If and W.E. Henley's Invictus. W.E. Henley wrote some fantastic books, not so popular now, but happily available on Kindle. Anyway, the phrase became symbolic of the British people, and particularly of those who were students of the English public school system during the Victorian era. Such schools were heavily influenced by Stoicism and aimed to instill a code of discipline and devotion to duty in their pupils through character-building competitive sports, as immortalised in the poem Vitae Lampada, and corporal punishments and cold showers. So, I was amused that's how the paragraph ended. Anyway, stiff upper lip does seem to be something commonly identified with the UK. Moving on to another thing commonly associated with the UK, Izzy Ready. That's his Instagram name. He suggested S is for savage. Haha, kidding. The title, Sir. So, first of all, just had a look at, say, the Order of the Garter, founded in 1348 and still going. In medieval times, King Edward III was so inspired by tales of King Arthur and the chivalry of the Knights of the Round Table that he set up his own group of honourable knights called the Order of the Garter. Nearly 700 years later, the Order is the oldest and most senior order of chivalry in Britain. The knights, now both male and female, used to be limited to aristocracy, but today they are chosen from a variety of backgrounds in recognition for their public service. Today, the order includes the King, who is sovereign of the Garter, several members of the royal family, and 24 knights chosen in recognition of their work. Knights of the Garter are chosen personally by the sovereign to honour those who have held public office, who have contributed in a particular way to national life, or who have served the sovereign personally. These have included Marshal of the RAF, Lord Stirrup, and former Prime Ministers Sir John Major and Sir Winston Churchill. The patron saint of the order is St. George, patron saint of soldiers and also of England, and if there are vacancies in the order, appointments are announced on St. George's Day, 23rd of April. Well, the next suggestion was from my friend on Instagram, Mr. Two Green Thumbs, as if it was a zombie playing video games. He is, dare I say it, not a James Bond fan. But the first thing that came into his mind was Scaramanga, Francisco Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun. Ian Fleming perhaps named him after George Scaramanga, with whom Ian Fleming had a number of schoolboy fights. And reportedly, there was another member of the Scaramanga family who had fights with Ian Fleming's nephew. So the fact that there was a multi-generational feud going on may well have led to the final novel, the final full-length novel from Ian Fleming, starring a brutal man named Scaramanga. He doesn't resemble too much the Christopher Lee character from the 1974 film, except perhaps in his height. I'm reading from this Francisco Paco Pistols Scaramanga. I quite like that. The film could have gone with Paco Pistols or Pistols Paco, but went with Francisco Scaramanga instead. In the novel, M reads a file, and part of it has been written by Sir James, a psychologist who occasionally helps out the Secret Service. The psychologist has written, Time notes, but does not comment upon the fact that this man cannot whistle. Now, it may only be myth, and it is certainly not medical science, but there is a popular theory that a man who cannot whistle has homosexual tendencies. At this point, the reader may care to experiment, and from his self-knowledge, help prove or disprove this item of folklore. M hadn't whistled since he was a boy. Unconsciously, his mouth pursed and a clear note was emitted. He uttered an impatient "ta" and continued with his reading. This actually got onto an episode of QI where they claimed that Ian Fleming believed that homosexuals could not whistle, which, given Ian Fleming's social circle, seems a pretty unlikely belief for him to hold. Anyway, not to give too many spoilers, but somewhere in the Bond series, Bond reads a cable from M, deciphered by a lovely lady, and is offered a knighthood, a KCMG. Bond already has his CMG for services past and present to Britain, but he turns it down because of his love of anonymity. So, this immediately begs the question, what is a CMG? Well, it's the most distinguished order of St. Michael and St. George, the British Order of Knighthood, founded in 1818 by the Prince Regent, later King George IV, to commemorate the British protectorate over the Ionian Islands, now in Greece, and Malta, which came under British rule in 1814. Originally, membership was exclusively for inhabitants of the Ionian Islands and Malta, as well as for British citizens who had performed important government services in the Mediterranean area. Since 1879, any citizen of the United Kingdom has been eligible. However, the honour is conferred mostly on officials in colonial affairs, foreign service officers and diplomats and others who have performed important duties in Commonwealth countries. Foreigners may be admitted as honorary members. This, of course, is referenced in the 1980s sitcom Yes, Minister. In the second series, the episode is Doing the Honours, and it's all about, well, the honours system. I'm just having a look through the book I have. Yes, in the FCO, the honours are the Cross of St Michael and St George, CMG, KCMG and GCMG. The Foreign Office is not popular throughout the rest of the civil service, and is widely held that the CMG stands for Call Me God, the KCMG for Kindly Call Me God, and the GCMG for God Calls Me God. Well, there we go. I do love a bit of Yes Minister, a grand bit of British satire. And satire was indeed suggested, along with sarcasm, by several friends on Facebook, particularly Sue, who suggested that sarcasm should be a topic covered. But I think I might need to do another special episode on this. S is for satire, quite possibly. S, of course, is for sandwiches. Fans of the movie Moonraker will remember what an important thing a cucumber sandwich can be. Allegedly, the sandwich was invented in 1762. John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, invented the meal that changed dining forever. The story goes that he was playing cards and did not want to leave the gaming table to eat. He asked for a serving of roast beef to be placed between 2 slices of bread so he could eat it with his hands. However, Sandwich's biographer, N.A.M. Roger, suggests Sandwich's commitments to the Navy and to politics and the arts means that the first sandwich was more likely to have been consumed at his desk. I found it really interesting. The first written usage of the English word appeared in Edward Gibbons's journal in 1762, as according to the Oxford English Dictionary. So he hasn't just written the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, he has given us the written evidence of the word sandwich. And there is indeed a special magazine, Sandwich and Food to Go News, all about sandwiches and presumably food to go, for the Sandwich and Food to Go Association. I feel this is something that would appear in the British satirical show Have I Got News for You? Nick and Martin on Facebook suggested S is for sausage rolls, and Nick and Debbie suggested that it was for a British food spelt S-C-O-N-E-S, and there are many debates about how to pronounce that word. I find it really interesting that it doesn't seem to depend on class, and it doesn't seem to depend on geography. There's just many different ways to say it. Is it scone, or is it scone? Is it scone, or is it scone? And there's all kinds of debates about whether it's jam and then cream and then cream and then jam, and goodness knows. But if you enjoy eating them, enjoy it. Oh, I said I had a few different books for this episode, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service gives us the Bondian moment of James Bond at the seaside, because S is for seaside, according to the Instagram account, Bondian Moments. So, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it's from chapter 1, Seascape with Figures. And since it's from chapter 1, it's no real spoiler. Let's have a look at this. To James Bond, sitting in one of the concrete shelters with his face to the sun, there was something poignant, ephemeral about it all. It reminded him almost too vividly of childhood, of the velvet feel of a hot powder sand and the painful grit of wet sand between young toes when the time came for him to put his shoes on, of the precious little pile of seashells, an interesting rack on his sill of his bedroom window. No! We'll have to leave that behind, darling. It'll dirty up your trunk. Of the small crabs scuttling away from the nervous fingers, groping beneath the seaweed in the rock pools. Of the swimming and swimming and swimming through the dancing waves. Always in those days, it seemed, lit with sunshine. And then the infuriating, inevitable time to come out. It was all there, his own childhood, spread out before him to have another look at. What a long time ago they were, those spade and bucket days. How far he had come since the freckles and the Cadbury milk chocolate flakes and the fizzy lemonade. Impatiently, Bond lit a cigarette, pulled his shoulders out of their slouch, and slammed the mawkish memories back into their long-closed file. Today, he was a grown-up, a man with years of dirty, dangerous memories. A spy. He was not sitting in this concrete hideout to sentimentalize about a pack of scrubby-smelling children on a beach scattered with bottle tops and lolly sticks, and fringed by sea thick with sun oil and putrid with the main drains of Royale. He was here, and he had chosen to be here to spy on a woman. Well, that section of Ian Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Many people love the film, but for me the book gets me more than the film. Anyway, on Instagram again, Fifth Chamber suggested S is for sartorial elegance, and the Facebook group moderator Yvonne suggested that S is for Sandringham. Sandringham is the much-loved country retreat of the British royal family and has been the private home to generations of British monarchs since 1862. In 1977, to mark her Silver Jubilee, the Queen opened the house and grounds to the public for the first time. You can explore Sandringham Royal Parkland by foot or bike or with a furry friend. It's good for dog walking. The 600-acre Royal Parkland has 2 waymarked trails winding through the woodlands and parkland with further unmarked paths for you to explore. It's in Norfolk, and it's one of the royal residences of Charles III, whose grandfather, George VI, and great-grandfather, George V, both died there. Fun fact. Anyway, it's a beautiful palace and has beautiful grounds. Anyway, moving on to the next few suggestions. Joseph Space Ranger on Instagram suggested S is for Spectre. Of course, the 2015 movie and the organisation first referenced in the novel Thunderball, 1961, and introduced in the films with From Russia with Love 2 years later, 1963, although they both claim that Dr. No was an operative. The Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge and Extortion. That's what Spectre stands for, allegedly. So, the next one is Sky. Kath on Facebook suggested the ever-changing colours that you don't get abroad. I do find that very true. When I came back to the UK the first time after 7 years in Turkish Cyprus, where the skies always looked like Renaissance paintings, the skies in England looked like a Constable painting. It wasn't covered in my sea episode, so I might have to go back to that. That was my penultimate suggestion. The final one is from Sifu Lamas, who suggested, I think it's pronounced Susie, and the Banshees, a 70s rock band. I'm not going to play music on the podcast unless I own it, unless I've created it. So I shall leave that one aside. And of course there is Simon Templar, but that was my last. So yeah, many suggestions for S, and I think we might have time for just one more episode on S before we move to T. If you have a suggestion for T, please do email me at albionneverdies, or you can contact me on Instagram at FlemingNeverDies. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time. Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture Albion Never Dies. This episode is S is for Satire. This is a topic that has been often requested. Humour has been requested, comedy has been requested. I thought I'd touch on this one because, well, I normally do respond to requests. If people request a topic, I normally include it as much as I can. Humour I've generally avoided. It is, of course, very subjective. Everyone has a slightly different sense of humour. Of course, there's a lot of culture in it, but then if you try and pull it out and work out what is the culture in a particular piece of humour, it can be a pretty humourless and joyless exercise. But I thought I'd have a go at this one. Satire is something I really enjoy, whether it's British satire or satire from around the world, and I thought it would give me a good chance to delve into some old favourites. So this is very much my take on satire. It's not supposed to be any kind of comprehensive history. It's more kind of an outline of the kind of things that I enjoy. I always feel like I'm on holiday for this episode. Very much enjoyed doing the research. But having said that, I work for an academic publishing company, so I couldn't resist going through our archives and seeing if there's been any academic literature on satire. First of all, just to see if there's some kind of definition. What is satire? And happily, I came across a book called Satire, Comedy and Mental Health, Coping The Limits of Critique, published 13th of January 2021. So this book included, as it's an academic text, a good definition of satire, and I thought it would be one to take a look at and think about, especially as this might come up later when I'm trying to work out, hang on, is this a piece of satire or is it just a piece of general humour? What is it? So, the definition from this academic book: satire is a genre with the purpose to critique and entertain. In other words, when we classify a form of creative expression as satire, we frame it as setting out to critique some social wrongness, as well as offering aesthetic pleasure associated with it, entertainment. These moral and aesthetic purposes interact in satire, although neither is wholly instrumental to the other, and they ultimately also pull in different directions, which makes the genre ambiguous. I really liked that little quote there, because I think it's important, to show that sometimes satire isn't funny, because it is engaging on some moral purpose. A lot of comedians talk about punching up. They want to make fun of people in power, which I suppose makes a certain sense. If you're making fun of those less fortunate than yourself, it's not really satire or comedy, it's just bullying. So a lot of comedy is based on making fun of people in power. Of course, that's not unique to the UK. You can very easily go online and find comparisons between almost any British comedy and American comedy, and that's something I'm not really going to go into. There's people who are simply more informed than I am about kind of transatlantic comedies. I think The Office is probably taken as the best example of, a successful British TV show that was remade for an American audience, because they really changed it significantly. They made, the characters reflect the environment that they are in. The worst example may well be Red Dwarf, which was such a British show, and it was hugely successful. I loved it. And they did try to remake it for the American audience, and I don't think it's the case that the American producers didn't get it. I think they got it and rejected it, and they completely made their own thing, which was disastrous, keeping a couple of the characters, which makes it all the weirder. And you can watch the pilot episode of the American Red Dwarf on YouTube, and it's a very, very surreal experience for anyone who enjoys Red Dwarf. I should say very firmly, if you have never seen Red Dwarf, don't watch the American pilot. That's really weird. But if you have seen every single episode of Red Dwarf, then this is one more to watch. It is very, very strange. But as I say, those differences are something that's heavily, heavily covered in the internet, on YouTube and various blogs. But, satire is not purely a British and American thing either. I can remember almost 10 years ago, some Turkish satire. There were some major, major protests against the government in Gezi Park. And these protests were taken off CNN Turk, the main news channel, one of the biggest news channels in Turkey. CNN Turk was told to stop showing it, so they stopped showing the protests in Istanbul and started showing penguin documentaries. So the next day, a lot of the protesters went along to Gezi Park carrying toy penguins and having penguins on t-shirts, and it became a bit of a symbol of the protest as they carried placards saying, CNN Turk, if you want to show penguins, come here and show this. It was all the more surreal because you can get the American CNN in Turkey, and these protests in Gezi Park were so huge that they did briefly occupy space on the American CNN. So it was weird if you have protests in Turkey that are on the American CNN, but they're not on the Turkish CNN. And of course, going through history, Turkey is the home of Nasruddin Hoxha. So this Hoxha is, of course, an Islamic teacher. In fact, Nasruddin was a qadar, so he was an Islamic judge. So in the medieval era, he travelled around Turkey dispensing out laws and justice and so on. A lot of countries in the medieval era had similar setups, and so he is a respected, powerful individual. His roundabout way of doing things and saying things is a big part of the humour. I enjoyed reading these things enormously when I was learning to be a translator. I feel there's a huge amount of Turkish culture within it. One of them is when Nasruddin Hoxha is asleep in bed and he gets woken up. His wife has heard some frightening noise outside and she wants him to go and check it out, and it's a bit bleary and grumpy, but he gets up to go and see what it is, and the wife is cowering under the blankets, and suddenly she hears the most terrible noise. You can't work out what it is, but it's thumping and pounding, and eventually he comes back and says it was nothing. And she says, but what was that loud noise? What was the thumping? And he replied, oh, my robe just fell down the stairs. And she said, a robe does not make that noise falling down the stairs. And he said, yeah, but I was inside the robe when it fell. There's many stories about Nasruddin. Again, I'm not sure if it contains exactly satire, but then again it gets into the question of what is satire. Is it just humour? I suppose one bit of undeniable satire is the fact that in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is where I lived, for decades, there's a newspaper called Avrupa, or Europe, and they were pretty left-leaning. In the 1980s, the government was under military power. The paper, Avrupa, was very, very, very critical, and so the government in Turkish Cyprus was told, close it down. So, okay, they follow the rules. Turkey is the supporter of Turkish Cyprus, so words were had, and the newspaper was closed. And the next week, the same journalists went to the same offices, same typewriters. They produced a newspaper with the same printing press, but instead of calling it Avrupa, they called it Africa. If we're not Europeans, we're Africans. So this newspaper is still happily going. Nothing changed but the title. And of course, I spent time in China where I'd say the Hong Kongese had a sharp sense of humour, particularly when in mainland China images of Winnie the Pooh were banned. This is because there were one too many posts on social media that the president of China looks like Winnie the Pooh. And it was particularly, he looks like Winnie the Pooh, and there's a picture of the Chinese president with the American president, then Obama. And Obama was compared to Tigger. The Japanese Premier Shinzo Abe was compared to Eeyore. A few Cantonese people I know said it seems funny because it's not insulting, it's cute, but I do think that they may have gone a bit too far when they said the president's wife looks like Piglet. So that was banned for a long time in mainland China. Eventually they allowed images of Winnie the Pooh, although not if they were comparing him to the president. But all the critics of China, whether in Hong Kong or whether in the countries around, the Philippines, they're all using images of Winnie the Pooh as in satirical contexts, shall we say. Anyway, this is a brief kind of potted history of bits of satire that I've come across. So I've seen it in other countries, and another country is, of course, the past. Hogarth was a satirist in the 1750s, and I think there you get into the moral purpose. So he would draw cartoons that shows, for example, the evils of gin drinking. So I think Gin Lane, originally published as a pair with Beer Street, he was part of his campaign against uncontrolled production and sale of cheap gin. And so Gin Lane is a very, it's a classic cartoon. It shows the debauchery of too much drink, and it culminated in the Gin Act of 1751, in which we started to have a bit more alcohol regulation. This is kind of a time when you really see a flowering of satire in history. It kind of becomes a time when you can start to learn history by looking through the cartoons that are going around at the time. So, for example, the Prince Regent, later George IV, was extensively satirised, criticised heavily for his general inattention to actual politics at a time when the gulf between rich and poor was vast, and his spending was profligate, and also his secret first marriage to Mrs. Fitzherbert, who, as the name suggests, was a Catholic. Had he done so openly, that may have barred him from the kingship. And, of course, his scandalous treatment of his consort, Princess, and later Queen Caroline. This is a time when, of course, Parliament was in the ascent. So either he tolerated these cartoons, and it said, some historians say that he found them quite funny himself, that he found them mocking him just rather amusing. But there's others who'd say that it could have been the parliamentarians were using these freedoms and were trying to push and see how far they could go. Of course, the King and Queen Caroline did separate. In fact, they separated shortly after the birth of their daughter. And he attempted to divorce his wife, and several attempts, including attempting to divorce her by accusing her of adultery. Despite his own long history of adultery, he barred her from his coronation, but she was much more popular than her estranged husband. There are numerous pamphlets published in her support during every round of the king's accusations. There are even mobs rioting, and the Duke of Wellington famously was caught up by one of these mobs, and they threatened him and demanded he show support for the Queen, and he replied, "Well, gentlemen, since you will have it so, God save the Queen, and may all your wives be like her." Again, a lot of satire started to push through, like 1750s, through the 1800s, and of course, in 1841 we have the foundation of Punch magazine by Henry Mayhew and the woodgraver Ebenezer Landells. What a great name, Ebenezer. I haven't met many actual Ebenezers in real life. Historically, it was at its most influential in the 1840s and 50s, and it helped coin the term cartoon in its modern sense as a humorous illustration, because of course with a wood engraver, Ebenezer, they were able to include many. And throughout the Victorian era it became popular. Of course, it was spread throughout the British Empire, so people all over the empire could read about Britain, and Brits would learn about the empire through this comedic magazine, which would also contain a large number of serious stories, so it would mix the humour with the cartoons, and had kind of status above that of many of the other kind of pamphlets and rags that were going around at the time. After the 40s, when its circulation peaked, it went into a long decline, eventually closing in 1992. In 1996, the businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed bought the rights to the name, having been the target of Private Eye, another satirical magazine, for quite a few years at that point. So he's tried to resurrect Punch, I suspect to deflect the humour being directed at him from Private Eye. Anyway, it failed, and he lost about £16 million attempting to resurrect it. But as I say, it was very powerful in its day, even quoted at times by The Times and the Sunday newspaper News of the World, and that was still going. So they used it as a column filler. So it kind of achieved a higher status. Just to comment on its name, it's known as Punch magazine after the Punch and Judy puppets. You know, we've got Punch, Judy, the policeman, the crocodile, which are rather reminiscent of the Turkish characters Karagöz and Hacivat. You can find variations of them throughout the former Ottoman Empire, so most prominently in Turkey, Greece, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there you actually have the class divide. So you have Karagöz, who represents the illiterate masses. So in the old Ottoman Empire, it's thought to be about 90% of people. Certainly 90% of Turks were illiterate, whereas Hacivat belonged to that educated 10% of, one might say, hyper-educated people. So he would speak, say, Persian, he would speak Ottoman Turkish, he would use poetical and literary language. Karagöz, of course, the little man is the more popular character, but Hacivat is the one with a level head. So Karagöz can outsmart Hacivat's superior education with his kind of native wit, his street smarts, but he's also incredibly impulsive, and he has a never-ending deluge of get-rich-quick schemes, which result in disaster. Does that tie into satire? Well, it was banned in Tunisia when it became a French protectorate, because it denounced colonialism, and they started poking fun there. And of course, as a modern puppet show, you've got Spitting Image, modern, 1980s. A puppet show that was very much satirical when it was running. Anyway, one of the joys of Punch magazine is it gave rise to a series of amusing articles about British history, culminated in the book 1066 and All That by Seller and Yeatman, the history book to end all history books. They say at the beginning, compulsory preface, this means you. Histories have previously been written with the object of extolling their authors. The object of this history is to console the reader. No other history does this. History is not what you thought, it is what you can remember. And so they have their poorly remembered kind of schoolboy's history. Chapter 1. The first date in English history is 55 BC, in which Julius Caesar, the memorable Roman emperor, landed, like all other successful invaders of these islands, at Thanet. This was in the olden days when the Romans were top nation on account of their classical education, etc. By the way, there is another date in English history. See William the Conqueror. Julius Caesar advanced very energetically, throwing his cavalry several thousands of paces all over the river Flumen, but the ancient Britons, though all well over military age, painted themselves true blue, or woad, and fought as heroically under their dashing queen, Boadicea, as they did in later thin red lines under the good queen, Victoria. Julius Caesar was therefore compelled to invade Britain again the following year, 54 BC, not 56, owing to the peculiar Roman method of counting, and having defeated the ancient Britons by unfair means such as battering rams, tortoises, hippocaus, centipedes, axes and bundles, set the memorable Latin sentence, Veni, Vidi, Vici, which the Romans, who were all very well educated, construed correctly. The Britons, however, still used the old pronunciation, understood him to have called them Weenie, Weedy, and Weaky Lost Heart, gave up the struggle, thinking he had already divided them into 3 parts. The ancient Britons were by no means savages before the conquest, and had already made great strides in civilization. For example, they buried each other in long round wheelbarrows, agriculture, burned each other alive, religion, under the guidance of even older Britons called Druids. The Roman conquest was, however, a good thing, since Britons were only natives at the time. I thoroughly enjoy 1066 and all that, and drop into it pretty regularly. Anyway, Punch magazine also had numerous cartoons of Winston Churchill throughout his political career, quite frequently portraying him as a bulldog. Churchill himself once suggested that long after he had passed, long after all his achievements were forgotten, the one thing that was likely to remain were cartoons of him as a bulldog. If you enjoy the the movie Skyfall, and you see the British Bulldog and Judi Dench's death, it kind of has a Churchillian look. Wow, it suggests that Churchill was right, that he as a bulldog may yet survive. I'm skipping a few centuries here. I'm skipping a few decades, going from 1750s to the 1980s in, I feel, record time. To go to Yes Minister. Yes Minister is one of my favourite TV shows of all time. It's a British political satire sitcom written by Anthony Jay and Jonathan Lynn. There are 3 7-episode series, and it was first transmitted on the BBC 2 from 1980 to 1984. There's a sequel, Yes Prime Minister, just 16 episodes from 1986 to 1988. All of them half an hour, which normally ends with a variation of the title, Yes Minister. There's one which is 1 hour long, which is of course the Christmas special. For the special Bond connection, if you want a James Bond connection, it has the same Governor of the Bank of England actor as the Governor of the Bank of England actor in Goldfinger. A strange little connection. Part of the joy of it is you have a minister, you have an experienced civil servant whose job is to do his wishes, but of course ministers change round. They are, generalists. They are, first, say, Minister of Education, might move on to Foreign Secretary if they do well, or whatever. Whereas the civil service, they stay within it, and they are the expert. So the joy of the series is watching the generalist, who in theory is in authority, trying to get his plots to happen in the face of opposition from the specialist. And often we have Bernard, who is the minister's assistant, but of course is part of the civil service, who is kind of between the 2 grand men. Anyway, part of the joy of it is that it just feels very well researched, and even though this came out in the early 80s, the first episodes, much of it still feels quite present, and there's still many odd little facts from it which are not facts, they are satire, which are very widely believed. The classic one is that many Brits still believe that the EU is trying to end the British sausage because there's not enough meat within it. This originally came from Yes Minister. But then some of them feel rather real. So, for example, there's the episode The Moral Dimension, in which Hacker and his staff are on a trade mission to the fictional Islamic State of Qumran, which is kind of portrayed as somewhere in the Middle East, maybe somewhere in the Gulf. And there, they secretly consume alcohol. It's a rather farcical episode in parts, but it's based on a real incident that took place in Pakistan involving then Prime Minister Jim Callaghan and his head policy advisor Bernard Donahue, the latter of whom informed the writers Anthony Jay and Jonathan Lynn after the incident, as long as they didn't reveal where it was. Quite a lot of the plot lines seem to have been drawn from things that insiders gave to the two writers. Marcia Falkender, Baroness Falkender now, was revealed as another source, and she was first the private secretary for and then the political secretary and head of political office to the Prime Minister Harold Wilson. So we seem to have some pretty well-connected individuals talking to the writers. So Lynn and Jay said that they worked on the stories for anything from 3 days to 2 weeks, and it took about 4 mornings to write all the dialogue. After they wrote the episode, they then show it to a secret source, always including someone who's an expert on the subject in question. And they would usually give them extra information, which, because it was true, was usually funnier than anything we might have thought. That's the writer's words. Even the sets kind of feel strangely real. The set designers were given access to the cabinet rooms, the state drawing rooms. For security purposes, the arrangement of the rooms were altered, and the views from the windows are never shown to conceal the layout of the buildings. So there's a huge amount of real information mixed in with rather farcical and ridiculous ideas. Anyway, it is something that I really enjoy, and I remember when it was in the United States, I was able to watch it on BritBox. I think here it comes up on, say, iPlayer. I got the books, which were published at the time, and of course it would have been an easy thing just to churn out the scripts, but instead they published them as if they had been written in the far future and everyone's retired and all the government folders have been opened under the 30-year rule, and the writers have gone through as historians. So, of course, these have, in theory, been published in the very far future, 2018. Jonathan Lynn and Anthony Jay write in the preface to this book, which is supposedly largely drawn from the diaries of the minister. So they say, we encountered 3 principal problem areas in editing these diaries: chronological, technical, and interpretation. First, chronology. At all times you're striven to maintain a chronological day-by-day account of each of the main events he retells, even though the original diaries are much more confused. There is a risk of historical inaccuracy in this approach, as Hacker himself was indeed deeply confused for most of his time in office, and the diaries perhaps ought to reflect this confusion. If, however, the diaries reflected his confusion in full, they would become virtually incomprehensible to the reader, as indeed the events themselves often were to Jim Hacker. Technically, we have completed and punctuated sentences, unmixed the metaphors and corrected the grammar, unless by leaving the original we can give insight into Hacker's state of mind. Finally, interpretation. Where the book is ambiguous, we have assumed that this is a deliberate exercise of his political skills. Often he was unclear about what events meant, but often he was deliberately vague. These diaries accurately reflect the mind of one of our outstanding national leaders. If the reflection seems clouded, it may not be the fault of the mirror. I do love the extra mile they went to for this. I suppose, if you want a satirical take on events now, there'd be few better places to start than Private Eye. As Punch magazine went into its long, slow decline, so Private Eye came to prominence as the new replacement. And the latest episode, that came out yesterday, the latest issue, which is issue number 1590. Goodness gracious, 1,590, and they're all really good. I've been reading them for years. The latest one, of course, is full of Prince Harry and his latest book. But they're hoping that he'll make up for the royal family before the coronation, William's or possibly George's. Private Eye, again, is a satirical magazine, and yet it will also cover, first of all, serious news at a national level. It's one of the very few publications that go into abuse by local councils and waste and graft by local councils, which I greatly appreciate. And they will also have Hackwatch and the Street of Shame, in which they're talking about misdeeds and misreporting in the national newspaper. So, for example, The Independent talking about Prince Harry, put, and I'm quoting, "Harry reveals he didn't cry over his mother's death for 17 years and recalls speaking to his then-girlfriend, Cressida Dick, saying, 'This is the first time I've been able to cry about my mum since the burial.'" As Private Eye points out, Cressida Dick is the 62-year-old lesbian ex-Met Police Commissioner. So goodness knows what name they intended to write, but the Independent rather got that one wrong. I did once hear of a gentleman who took a flight from London to Edinburgh, I think, and he forgot his passport, and of course Brits don't carry photo ID generally. But he had a copy of Private Eye, so to convince them that he was British, he went through with the customs officers explaining all of the jokes. There are some running jokes, so let me go into what they are. One of them, pretty recurrent, is the use of the term Ugandan discussions. Ugandan discussions, or a variation of it, such as discussing Ugandan affairs, is a euphemism for sex, normally whilst carrying out a supposedly official duty. This is an archaic term. It comes out from an incident at a party hosted by the journalist Neil Acheson and his first wife, in which fellow journalist Mary Kenny allegedly had, quote, "a meaningful confrontation with a former cabinet minister in the government of Milton Obote, later claiming they were upstairs discussing Uganda." I recall, I think it was Jeffrey Archer went on holiday with some glamorous model to Kenya, and so Private Eye had a lovely picture of the two of them walking along the beach referring to Kenyan discussions. So there's a few variations of that one. Tired and emotional, I feel that one's become quite popular. It's a euphemism for being drunk. It's used by the British press to avoid libel laws, coined by Private Eye after a BBC report which used the term describing the 60s Labour cabinet minister and deputy leader George Brown, who was an alcoholic. It was first appeared in a parody memo supposedly informing civil servants how to describe Brown's conduct and state of mind. Since you can't prove intoxication without forensic evidence, so journalists use the phrase tired and emotional quite happily. So yeah, they've got quite a few. I think one of them is that Elizabeth II was regularly referred to as Brenda, and Charles III as Brian. So I remember watching the TV show Spooks, a BBC spy series, broadcast sometimes in North America under the name MI5, but sometimes in Canada they would keep the original name Spooks, but they refer to Buckingham Palace as Brenda's Place. And of course, Prince Charles's life, as then was Prince Charles, was covered in The People's Prince. His romance with Diana was in Born to be Queen, and what subsequently unfolded was covered in Heir of Sorrows. So these are all columns. Many of these have been published as books. And in fact, the latest episodes, I keep calling them episodes, the latest editions of Private Eye have contained, by Dame Hedda Shoulders, a short story special. I'll just read out a little bit from The King of Troubles. "One does so worry that this awful crown thingy on the TV will make people think I'm some sort of weirdo." King Charles was in ruminative mood as he confided in his oldest and most trusted friend. "I mean, the viewers are bound to believe that it is a documentary, and that the strange, eccentric and bad-tempered Charlie on the telly is the same as your actual old friend Charles." There was no reply from the aspidistra in the corner of the royal drawing-room in Buckingham Palace. He is interrupted by Sir Alan Fitztightly, royal pen pursuant, steward of the Stinkwell and master of the Mont Blanc. "You're not talking to the plants again, are you, sire? I'm afraid the aspidistra doesn't have security clearance and the new Prime Minister has arrived." "Oh, not again. Oh, dear, oh, dear." He did actually greet Liz Truss with oh dear, didn't he? Anyway, these are great fun, and I do enjoy the Private Eye books. They have had a series, a long-running series on Prime Ministers. So I remember The Secret Diary of John Major, which was great fun. And the latest thing is the Prime Minister's highly confidential WhatsApp group, where Rishi Sunak will send a message saying, "Happy New Year, guys!" And Penny Mordaunt will reply, "Why? Are you resigning? After all, you've been Prime Minister for over 2 months. Surely it's my turn now. Great New Year bants, Penny. But seriously, I've got so much to be excited about, like Sunakasm. Theresa Coffrey, Health Minister, replies, what's that when it's at home? Or second home? Or fourth home? So it has all these parodies of all the top politicians. Anyway, that's enough of that. It's been almost half an hour, so I'll end by saying that if you'd like a bit of British satire, Private Eye magazine doesn't really have an online version. In fact, the editor often said that he wanted to replace the entire website with a single page, as a French satirical magazine does, which just says, "Go away and buy our magazine." So there's not too much on the website. They occasionally share bits, but you can see Ian Hislop himself on the TV show Have I Got News For You? Well over 60 series now. It's been going for about 30 years, and you can see the editor who provides some of the serious information for the show, opposite the surreal comedian Paul Merton. Always a shock to the audience that Ian Hislop is in fact younger than Paul Merton. But there you can see the two fellas talking about British politics in a satirical way. I suspect this might be a fun way to learn about British politics, but I don't know. Maybe you can take a look and tell me what you think. S is for satire. Thank you very, very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. As I say, I've been asked to do humour and different types of comedy and cover them. This is one that I really enjoy. So maybe check out Yes Minister. Maybe check out Have I Got News For You. See what you think. And if you don't find it funny, well, just have a different sense of humour. Maybe check out some Turkish humour. Thank you very much. Goodbye.